So that's the structure of the report. And now I'd like to talk about the main omission as far as I see it. And that is that an increase in GDP will increase emissions. There is a little graph on the side here that you can see. Oops, sorry. Our GDP emissions worldwide are constantly increasing, and with it, since 1990 to 2021, the global emissions have also been increasing, although the rate of increase has slowed down slightly. But there is no absolute decoupling between GDP emissions, rate of growth of the economy, and emissions. But the Climate Change Commission still prescribes to a thinking that we need growth in the economy. But with that thinking, we will always have increasing emissions. So an absolute decoupling of the economic growth from emissions has not been achieved yet. What we see here is a little bit of a weakening, which for individual countries can come from offshoring emissions. So that means we are no longer producing the cars in our own country. So the emissions with car productions are all in China or in Japan or in Europe and no longer in New Zealand. And then New Zealand looks good, but the emissions are not going away. And then there are in many economies structural changes. So we are going more towards a service economy, more banking is contributing to the GDP, and less hardcore production. So that's why the emissions profile of countries is slightly changing. But it's not because we are actually doing actual reductions to gross emissions. So just to prove to you that the Climate Change Commission is believing in the growth paradigm, here's a sentence out of the report, out of the advice report. Our economic modeling indicates that the economy would continue to grow under the recommended emissions budgets. So there is some concern, you know, if we do certain sustainability matters, suddenly the economy will grow no longer, but the Climate Change Commission really says we are still growing, and that's also our intention. On the other hand, the IPC is asking for emissions reductions of about 8% annually until 2030 to stay within 1.5 degrees of global heating above pre-industrial levels. So to achieve that, to achieve 8% annually, we have to do better than what is currently produced in the advice report. And from my point of view, the only realistically achievable option is actually a thing called degrowth. And just to explain a little bit more what I mean with degrowth, or what other people think about degrowth, it is actually a planned reduction of throughput through the economy. Only when we slow the economy down, if we slow down our GDP growth, we can also reduce emissions reductions meaningfully. So this might be a reduction of paid working hours. It will definitely be a focus on essential needs of everyone, a provision of basic requirements for everyone. It will be it should be a proper funding of public services, and it will be a greater sharing community, not just car sharing, but other things as well. So in short, it will be less stuff and more relationships. But that will be a topic for another ESR webinar, and I don't want to go too much into that. But there is a website of the people that came together in New Zealand around degrowth. So it's just www.degrowth.nz. And there are also many other people in other countries working on that topic. So the not so minor omissions, there is the first one that actually zero emissions are quite rare in these days. Look at electric vehicles. They have about a third of the carbon footprint of a fossil fuel car. So if in the advice report, if they are saying we are changing our fleet from fossil fuel cars to electric vehicles, that does not mean we go down to zero emissions. We are just offshoring the emissions that are related to the production and manufacturing of an electric vehicle. So the emissions in Japan, where the Nissan Leaf is being made, and also in China, where quite a few of the electric cars are coming from now, they are going up, while our emissions will come down. So we are trying also here, through the purchase of more products like electric vehicles, we are trying to buying our way out of emissions, and that solution is actually limited. We also have to consider in the same vein that all forms of renewable energy, like windmills, solar panels, dams, and geothermals, they have a carbon footprint until they are all produced using 100% renewables. So that will be a while until 100%, until solar panels that made with 100% renewables make another solar panel made out of 100% renewables. So that's why we are still adding to our total emissions as we go at the moment. And the second not so minor emission is the climate crisis is a symptom of planetary overshoot and has to be dealt with accordingly as a general overshoot that humanity is currently having on this planet. So you might have seen these 9 areas of the planet that are currently being watched in terms of overshoots. So climate change is not critical at the moment, or the climate crisis, but the biodiversity loss is. We are talking about the 6th mass extinction right now, and we also have in the agriculture an overshoot in our phosphorus cycle and in our nitrogen cycle. And the advice report is not mentioning that at all. So we are sort of left with the thinking, if we get a handle on the climate crisis, everything will be fine. But that's not right. The climate crisis is just one of 9 other areas where humanity has a problem with overshoots, or it can have. So the main points, these are the 19 recommendations of the report. So the very first one is to commit to less than 362 megatons of CO2 equivalents, gross emissions, for the second emissions budget. So here is a clear target, here's a number given, and it's actually a focus on gross emissions. So that's a good thing, because as you know, at the moment, the previous government and today's government, they are still working with a gross emission starting point and a net emission target. And the net emissions are the gross emissions of a year minus the forests that are being planted or coming to fruition during that year. So we are comparing not apples with apples, and with a heavy reliance on forestry planting, we are also not very much focused as a country on the reduction of gross emissions. And that's what actually counts and what we actually need, because the reduction in gross emissions, they will always be done, while forestry can be quite doubtful. Forests can get sick, forests can burn down, forests cannot grow, and then the emissions reductions will not eventuate. So that's a good thing that the Climate Change Commission is now actually focusing on gross emissions. The second point is communicate gross emissions and emissions removals through forestry out to 2050 and beyond. This is just a communications thing, but the interesting thing is actually the 2050 and beyond. If we are relying on forestry to get to net zero, then we have to keep planting forests after 2050 as well, because we always need new forests to take emissions out of the atmosphere if we are not having reduced gross emissions by 2050. And we are only aiming at a net zero target by by 2050. So we will still have gross emissions by 2050, offset by net emission, by forest replanting. The third point is implement an amended ETS that separates the incentives for gross emissions reductions from those applying to forestry and can provide durable incentives to net carbon dioxide removals by forests through to and beyond 2050. So here comes the first thing about the ETS, which actually favors forestry planting over the reduction in gross emissions. The reason is forestry planting comes cheaper than the reduction of gross emissions. So people are going for the for forestry first, and the Climate Change Commission wants to make changes to the ETS to remedy that fact. The third one is accelerated EV Maori emissions reductions by allocating resources direct to EV. Where there are 3 dots, I have just taken a bit of flowery language out of the recommendations, but otherwise what I'm reciting here are exactly the 19 recommendations. The fifth one says ensure EV Maori can drive the integration of Mātauranga Maori into policy design. The sixth one is enable a fair, inclusive, and equitable transition. So that's about just transition. But you see, there are no numbers, there are no dates given. These are all very nice words we all subscribe to. Number 7, make use of existing mechanisms to manage impacts of climate policies in the interim rather than delaying climate action. So that means basically use the technology and what we got at the moment and get on with it. And don't say, oh, we got until 2030, like yesterday, the National Party said with regards to farm emissions, they want to take time out until 2030. Here the climate, not related to that one, but in general, the Climate Change Commission's advice is get on with the job right now. Number 8, advance advisory and extension services to farmers. So here again, no firm target for farm emissions, but more advice, more services, more caring about the farming community. And ninth one, advance the agricultural emissions pricing system to enable recognition of a broader range of emissions reducing practices. So they are a bit hard done by. There might be other stuff that can be counted. And incentivize gross emissions reductions in line with the 2050 target. So again, good focus on gross emissions. Number 10, implement an integrated planning system that builds urban areas upward. So this is about what we should do in terms of our urban living. And then incentivize comprehensive retrofits of buildings. Number 12, prohibit the new installation of fossil fuel gas in buildings. That's a good idea, but again, no target given. Prioritize and accelerate renewable electricity generation build. Again, yeah, I think we all want that, but when, how, tangible targets are missing. Number 14, pursue more widespread process heat decarbonization. Number 15, set objectives for the role of forests with respect to emissions. So that's again the role of forests compared to reductions of gross emissions. Then number 16, simplify planning and increase funding for integrated transport networks that optimize public and active transport. For major population centers, the government should also complete cycleways networks by 2030 and take steps to complete rapid transport networks by 2035. Number 17, rapidly resolve the barriers to scaling up vehicle charging infrastructure. So in terms of our transport emissions, you see in number 16, there is a focus on active transport, okay. But in number 17, it looks like the main barrier is currently seen as not having enough charging stations. And I think that is a little bit of a red herring right now. It might come to it in the future. Number 18, develop incentives to accelerate the uptake of zero emissions commercial vehicles. So that's a focus on vans and utes that are currently not available and also not part of any incentive schemes. And the last recommendation is apply regulatory and policy instruments to achieve the optimal use and efficiency of landfill gas capture systems and technology at all landfills. Again, it's just the advice given. Look into the gas capture of landfills, but no dates, no target numbers. Okay, what are the good points? I pointed out a few already, but perhaps in a kind of a summary. It is the turning of the focus on gross emissions reductions away from net emissions. That's really positive that the Climate Change Commission has woken up to that, and I hope that filters through to any future government action. So recommendation number 1 is providing a number for a gross emissions target. Also, the critique in the advice document of aspects of the emissions trading scheme, especially incentivizing afforestation over gross emissions reduction. So the Climate Change Commission wants us to move away from that and separate the ETS. So there are different rules for gross emissions reductions and afforestation. Then there's a critique of industrial free allocations within the ETS. So certain industries, I think the steel industry is one of them, they are not included in the ETS at the moment. And it has been seen overseas that is actually hindering making any progress in reducing overall gross emissions if certain parts of the industry has got a free ride. Also, the system is in place officially. And then there are 2 nice text boxes in the document. One is on hydrogen, and it's actually quite critical on hydrogen. It says it's only usable or should only be used for niche applications. The Commission says use electricity directly, so don't go through an inefficient electrolysis process and then inefficient fuel cells. So use, for example, electricity direct in cars. And then they also, in line with what the Parliamentary Commission for the Environment has pointed out a few months ago, exporting of hydrogen can conflict with domestic decarbonization. The government, MBIE, and the Minister for Energy thinks we have too much we have too much renewable energy. We can produce green hydrogen and export that. At the moment, we don't have enough renewable energy to produce green hydrogen and export it. We are in every winter in the last 2, and I think even now, we are in danger of running out of enough electricity when it comes to a very cold winter morning. And so there is no enough built-in electricity consumption, electricity generation for us to become an exporter of hydrogen and basically become a raw material supplier to the world as we have been in the past with wool and meat. We should actually do much better. We should produce value-added products, and we should not export raw materials like hydrogen to others to do the value adding. And the Climate Change Commission is critical of that, and it's also critical of carbon capture as one of the solutions. It says carbon capture is more a reduction than an avoidance technology for carbon emissions. With that, it is meant some people trying to capture carbon in their chimneys. So basically the carbon gets produced and some of it gets captured and then buried underground or so. And that's more a reduction, but it's not a total avoidance. The process is still going on. And it's also a matter of fact that at the moment worldwide, no successful large-scale carbon capture operation is actually working. So these 2 things are quite nice, but in terms of the shortcomings, and you might have already read between my lines. The document is using many nice buzzwords we all can subscribe to, but it stays quite vague. Also, it claims to advise on actions. It hides behind policy recommendations. You know, even in the public consultations, the Climate Change Commission always says, yeah, we are only trying to trigger policy development. We are trying to get something going. But from my point of view, we are further ahead. Other countries, they have clear targets, they have clear deadlines, while the Climate Change Commission is not reporting them, is not giving that advice to the government to put in clearer targets like our partners overseas are doing. So most of the 19 recommendations do not contain numbers or dates. And maintaining also that another thing that the advice does, it has a split between our domestic targets according to the Zero Carbon Act, so that is driving our emissions down to net zero by 2050, and global targets made under the National Determined Contribution and for the COP conferences. So, you know, the government has made certain climate emissions reduction targets for 2030, and also James Shore said at the last COP conference he joined the alliance to reduce methane emissions by 30%. The Climate Change Commission does not advise how these targets could be achieved. They are just focused on that net zero target by 2050. But I can only say there is only one climate emergency. And we have domestic targets and we have global targets. But the Climate Change Commission has only one. They should advise how we can achieve or even better all these targets and numbers that the government has given out. So if you go into details and now through these various areas of industry where the report gives advice. In terms of agriculture, the methane target reduction is only 10% and not the 30% that was promised at the last COP, as I just mentioned. But on the other hand, globally, methane reductions are seen as very beneficial to slow down global heating in the short term. Methane is a far shorter-lived gas. So if we can reduce our methane emissions domestically and globally, now we can in the near future reduce global carbon emissions, while CO2 is in the atmosphere for hundreds of years, and we can't get that down, but we can reduce our methane emissions straight away and get a reduction. And then in terms of agriculture, there is, for example, in the report, no demand for herd reductions like other countries are doing. To my knowledge, the Netherlands have a target of a certain herd reduction of animals actually to get the emissions down. In terms of the built environment, the building code is not referred to related to zero emissions buildings. So again, the advice talks about zero emission buildings, the so-called passive house regulations, but it is not insisting on that we look into the numbers that our building code actually contains, and they are far too weak, so that any new build is still can still be built with still requiring lots of heating or air conditioning, and therefore the building is producing lots of emissions when in service. So that requires a strengthening of numbers. Another omission is actually that solar hot water heating is still ignored. It's not being talked in the advice, and that is in line with ICA practices. ICA is also ignoring solar hot water heating. On the other hand, solar hot water heating is a very successful technology with a very short payback time, and it is successfully employed overseas. The industry here in New Zealand has just a very bad reputation because of some cowboys in the 90s and early 2000s that have given that energy or a reduction form a very bad rep. There is no end date for gas connections. The UK has got that, for example. And the so-called vehicle-to-grid technology requires stronger wording in the advice. There is talk about it. So that is meant when you have an EV vehicle and you park that in your garage and it's connected to your house, you can use the relatively big electric vehicle battery as your storage device. In Japan, after the Fukushima disaster, it has been legislated that all electric vehicles have to have that capability, the vehicle-to-grid capability. And all Nissan Leafs that are produced after whenever 2015 and coming into the country as second-hand imports, they got that technology on board, but we are not making use of it at the moment. In terms of energy and industry and energy generation, electrical energy generation, there is no discussion in the document of current electricity pricing process, which favors fossil fuels. ESR has actually written to the Ministry for Energy and other parliamentarians and pointed that out. Our half-hourly auctions for electricity supply, for electricity generation, they are favoring the highest bidder in that sense, that everyone who supplies energy to the grid always gets the price of the highest bidder. At the moment, our wind farms are supplying electrical energy cheaper than the Huntly power station. The coal-fired Huntly power station is the most expensive energy generation that we have at the moment. But after every auction, everyone else gets the price that Huntly demands. And that means also the wind farms get paid extremely well. And so that's why everyone in the country, even the renewable energy producers, have an interest that people like the Huntly power station are being part of the electricity generation. And that is not helping to increase the amount of renewable electricity generation. But the Climate Change Commission has nothing to say on this. And also, there is no demand for a central regulatory body for the electricity industry to manage distributed generation and a smart grid. What we are having in front of us at the moment with distributed generation on people's houses, on people's roofs, for windmills, for even individual windmills, there are new forms of renewable energy coming constantly to the grid, and someone has to coordinate that. And the individual, after the privatization of the electricity industry in New Zealand, there is no overarching body to really regulate and drive that process forward. And my opinion is it needs such a central body so that we make good progress with a smart grid and distribute electricity generation. That also has been put to the various authorities, but so far nothing seems to move. Continuing with the shortcomings in terms of forests, there's a clearer direction required, including numbers. There's lots of talk about it, but how much forests of what kind should still be planted is lacking at the moment. In terms of transport, there is no end date for fossil fuel cars given. We in New Zealand, we have no local car industry to protect. I can understand if the car industry is going to be able to produce electric cars, but we have no local car industry to protect. We in New Zealand, we have no local car industry to protect. I can understand if the car industry is going to be able to produce electric cars, but we have no local car industry to protect. governments in Europe or America or Japan, if they are protecting their industry and are a bit soft on them. But even they have, for example, in Europe, there is an end date of 2030 for fossil fuel cars. We haven't got that here, and we only have to restrict the imports. And also, if we want to do something right now about these gas belching cars, we could align our emission standards with the European standards. We are at the moment well behind, and we are becoming the dumping ground for old technology. Everything what we import could actually have reduced emissions, but we are failing to upgrade our standards. In terms of waste, there is talk about waste to energy. That means an incineration plant. The advice is not straightforward, which is good, but I think in general, waste incineration should not be considered. We should be working hard towards a zero waste strategy in this country. And then in terms of circular economy and the bioeconomy, there is stronger language and dates required around things like product stewardship schemes and the right to repair legislation, which is in parliaments and being talked about in other countries, but not to be seen in New Zealand. So here comes the last slide, takeaways for the Hungaries. In summary, I think we are having a climate emergency. We have declared that. And we have to face up to the task ahead of reducing gross emissions by at least 8% per year, which is similar to emissions reductions accidentally achieved during COVID lockdowns. So that tells you a little bit of the amount of reductions of economic activity we need to get to these 8% reductions in emissions per annum. Since emissions are linked to GDP growth, we have to seriously discuss degrowth, and I gave you some pointers to that. The draft advice document is too general and does not include enough concrete targets compared with best practices overseas. I would expect the Climate Change Commission to have more insight and convey that insight to New Zealanders of what's happening outside of the country and what other countries are doing. But it has to be said, the Climate Change Commission is prepared to listen during the consultation process. That's my experience from the first consultation process, and it is now. So they are happy to hear from us, and they are happy to revise their document. But my last bullet point, the Climate Change Commission is not the government. So we have to wait and watch what happens after the final advice at the end of the year is given, and what the government of that day then is doing with that advice. And we might have to do more submissions, and we have to raise our voices again in that context. So thank you very much. Thanks for your attention. And I like to open the floor now for any questions and discussions you want to entertain. And if you have a contribution, please either raise your hand. This can be done by a symbol, and unmute yourself.
Well, very good, Thomas, that you've done that. The 362 megatons gross emissions for the second budget, when does that have to be reached by?
That is as far as I understand, that's the target of the period between 2026 and 2030. So that is less than what we are having in the current period of 2022 to 2025. And it also includes already the adjustment for that. The first period is actually 4 years, the second period is 5 years. So that's the overall target.
And are we still using the target emissions, the target emissions thing for net emissions that can't be related back to what the IPC says?
Yeah, that has not been rectified. We are still having a net emissions target, but what that is actually a gross emissions target. This should be the limit of our emissions during that period over those 4 years. So there's actually a ceiling has been created that we should not exceed. Whether this happens or not, whether anyone listens, is a different story. But it's for the first time the Commission is actually promoting the total gross emissions target. Okay.
Yeah, that's very good that they're doing that.
Yeah, I think so too. So Doug Wilson has got his hand up.
Thanks, Thomas. Really good to see good summary of the recommendations there, and thanks for bringing all that together for us. Just a question in regards to, from your background, in terms of the degrowth option. I mean, are there any OECD countries or ones that we would normally compare ourselves with that are actually considering a degrowth, and in terms of the economic impacts that might have, especially for lower socioeconomic, when you add it against the equitable transition, it becomes very difficult to see how that can work. So just wondering about your comments on the degrowth and how that potentially could work in that situation.
Yes, there is nothing in progress right now, but I can tell you two things. Emmanuel Macron, the French president, he said a few months ago that the area of abundance might be achieved. So he said publicly, we might have sort of achieved the limit to where we think everything will grow, everything will get bigger and faster, and so on. He said the area of abundance might be achieved, and that was sort of a hint. We might have to prepare for less growth or actually shrinking of the economy. I don't want to say degrowth. And also in the Netherlands, I read something lately. People are realizing they are the highest. They are the one of the countries with the highest population per square kilometer. So, all our problems we are having are unfortunately related through the relationship of population per land and per resources that we can entertain and feed and maintain that population. And the Dutch people realize there are quite a lot of people in a very confined space in the Netherlands, and they are reaching certain limits. And I think this is what we are also reaching globally. So there are people that are. These are the two examples I can give you where at the public level this has been raised, but there is I must admit, there's no one actively at the governmental level saying, so now let's prepare for a reduction in GDP. But I think we have to bring that question up and face that discussion, and also how we then would implement such a scheme. But many people are in various groups around the world are working on the issue. Okay, next one is Catherine has put her hand up, and please unmute yourself.
Kia ora. Thank you, Thomas. That was a really, really good comprehensive summary overview of the advice, which I've only read 3 chapters of the whole thing. So it's really helpful and some really good, sharp analysis. And I really like the way you started with the GDP growth, or the connection between GDP growth and emissions, and bringing in degrowth, which I see as coming more and more into the discussions at many levels. It's nowhere near enough, but it is starting. So following on from that, I have issue with the energy chapter in terms of the very strong language to push a very fast, rapid, and sustained, enormous sounding renewable energy, which I know we need renewable energy to decarbonize, but I feel that if we are talking about planetary boundaries and many ecological overshoots that we've already gone beyond, and that the social thresholds that we haven't even reached. We have, I think, for New Zealand, equity is below. I think most of you would have seen the donut economics model, and equity is really poor in New Zealand. And I am worried, and I see it in Taranaki. I'm based in Taranaki. The huge push for offshore wind farm. They're talking about 600 wind turbines offshore. And only last week, a couple of the company went to a high school and talking about their 60. They're starting with just 60 wind farm offshore, and how the kids need to be in it. That this is their future, and maybe, but I from what all the things that we've read, it's just going to be energies that they can use to make hydrogen. You mentioned we haven't got enough energy. So the 2 things are just spinning with each other. They said they can't build enough renewable energy because there is not an economic opportunity. Therefore, they're going to make green hydrogen, and they say there's a market. So the 2 things are just driving each other. And I'm glad that that the Commission is warned about the export of hydrogen. But I think that box can still be a bit stronger, because I think it supports hydrogen for freight or heavy transport, which I am not so sure. I think I'm much more a supporter for electric rail. And the other thing is the carbon capture and storage box. I think that's a really poorly written box. I looked through some of the references. Most of them are from industries. And there is no mention of how many of those projects have failed. They actually have not stored, or they might have captured some, but it's not actually, safely in the ground. And you and I know that. I think that box is really needs to be rewritten, really. And in I get the conclusion from that box is that New Zealand needs an enabling legislative framework for carbon capture and storage. That's the bit that I got. I see you got a different bit, so you're probably right as well. We somehow see different bits of the same box. We have so these engineers here. Maybe we can all have a good look at it and make our own views and comments. Well, thank you.
Yeah, just a comment on I've read that box about the carbon capture. You are right, the wording can be stronger. But like with offshore wind farms, I'm also not in favor of offshore wind farms. The electricity from there is twice as expensive than onshore wind farms. But we need regulation, and that's what's currently underway. There is regulation being designed for offshore wind farms, so that the industry cannot just go ahead and do it. And the same applies to carbon capture. The Climate Change Commission is quite negative, but nevertheless we need regulation around it, so that it's just not just happen. Like, for example, with artificial intelligence, there's no regulation at the moment, and the big software companies are pushing it towards us. So I would not object necessarily to regulation, but I would object to big trials in carbon capture. But let's see, we can certainly put a few sentences in around a stronger wording.
Sorry, if I could just add one point, I've actually put on chat my views. I have to go to the DANZ webinar now, which I think Catherine and maybe others are going to be joining us. But carbon capture and utilization, not carbon capture and storage. You've got to make that distinction. But anyway, I've made an offer to peer review the submission before Monday when I've got a Resource Management Act hearing. So thank you very much.
Okay, yeah, thank you,
Thomas.
Thank you.
Excellent.
So now over to Brian. Brian, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, sorry, pushing the wrong button. Thank you, Thomas. Yeah, that's a very, very thorough summary of everything, and totally applaud you for, and who else has helped you with that, because it is really, really good. Will come make a comment and maybe ask a question in terms of the actions that the Climate Change Commission don't, there's a void there in their recommended actions, and I can understand that. Now, for the last 15 years, I have been attempting to get the government interested in a manufacturer of solar cells, solar photovoltaic solar cells, and all the primary materials that go into that. And I've had some success, but I've had an awful lot of rejection. And quite simply, in New Zealand, we have the pure silica sands. We have the gas that can form the carbon reductant and be recycled with new technology. And we do not, and we've got renewable energy that will power all that process. We are now, at the moment, we are importing dirty solar panels, as you've said. The other thing is that our role in the world to reduce, we can change our own direct emissions, and everybody says we're a bit small, and it doesn't make any difference. But we have the ability to affect the manufacture of things overseas with our, we have the ability to do that. We have to just get away from agriculture, and we have to go into these new things. We know that. Norway are in the same boat. They have transferred, they have changed their aluminium smelters to silicon refineries. And these this is, and they make solar panels, but they import rock silica from Spain. We have pure silica stuff here that we can use ourselves. Now, what I'm saying with all of this is it's an action, and we tell the world we're doing this. We're going to do it inside New Zealand because the big corporates don't want to come here. We're off the radar screen. So we have to get the government to kickstart this. And we James Shaw, I went to a meeting with him, with his party when he came back from the last meeting on climate change. I forget when that was, just before the end of the year last year. And I asked him the question, I said, are you prepared to support mining in New Zealand to make solar panels? And he said, yes. Mm-hmm. That was a bit of an achievement because, mining is a dirty word in itself. But he said, yes, we know that we have to do these things. And because he's so supportive of solar after he came back, he couldn't stop talking about it. So I just throw that all at you, and I'm happy to give me more information about it all. But I think it supports everything you've done and suggested there, and I want to find ways of progressing it more, with the help of others. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Brian. Godfrey, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Professor Thomas. I too believe that your summary was very helpful. I too would like to thank you for your summary, because I have not read the report, and it really made a lot of sense, your summary. I've just got two points to make. One is a question, really. I got lost in the graph, the slide, that there's a graph down at the bottom, fairly needed, for me anyhow, it needed extra explanation. The one with it was a pie graph with different concentric roles, and I think it was New Zealand's response to various issues. So if others feel that way, it would be great to get a bit of an extra response. And the other thing was the GDP decrease, which I think, again, I agree with fundamentally, but it's a huge ask, because the world is just absolutely, all the economists in the world, all the bankers, all the financiers, every business in the world thinks about growth, GDP growth, and we all know the relationship between share market and GDP growth, and profits and GDP growth, and income tax coming into governments and GDP growth, and just goes on and on and on. So the concept of reducing it is a hugely difficult one for the world to get. But of course, we've got climate change, so we better get it. So I mean, I'm totally agreeing with it, but I'm also saying that it needs very, very special effort, because that one's just not going to be swallowed at all easily.
Yeah.
Yeah, would you like to comment at all? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Godfrey. I like to comment. I think you were referring to that overshoot diagram, where various areas of human activity were mentioned, or just planetary activity, and there is where safe boundaries have been crossed, so that we basically have runaway issue in that particular parameter. I think one was biodiversity, or the loss of species. Is that the diagram you're
So where they were red, they were yes, where they were red, you were saying we're already past the threshold that's dangerous.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think that's sufficient for me to go back.
But you can Google that, or you can look it up. It's discussed since 10 years. We have these overshoots in 3 areas. One is the biodiversity loss. That's the the 6th mass extinction on Earth. We are losing species left, right, and center, similar to the time when we lost the dinosaurs. And the other two is phosphorus and nitrogen overshoot. So we are contaminating our soils and our groundwaters and our fresh waters with too much nitrogen and phosphorus for agriculture. And that's a known fact.
But I noticed the climate one was not overshoot, and I would have thought we must be very close to climate overshoot.
That's right. There are a number of these circles of various dates going back to 2010. There is none being drawn, as far as I know, in 2022 or so. But climate change is itching closer and closer towards a safe limit. And, you know, the 1.5 degree global heating is sort of seen as a threshold when we might get runaway climate change in certain aspects. So that's in terms of the explanation. And then in GDP growth, I agree with you. It is a tall ask to question basically the foundations, or the perceived foundations of all our well-being, GDP. But on the other hand, whenever you talk to anyone about GDP, everyone agrees with you, GDP is the completely wrong measure, actually. because GDP increases when we have COVID, when we have more people in hospitals. That creates more business for the healthcare sector. GDP increases when we have a traffic accident and have to repair our car, but it's not a good thing. So we are desperately looking, and there are also many books written about it. We're looking for other parameters. We are looking for how can we actually measure welfare, how can we measure well-being. At the moment, so far, GDP has always been taken for an easy proxy for human well-being. But on the other hand, we have found out past a certain level of GDP, the welfare and happiness of the population does not increase. So you can compare, the US has got the highest GDP per capita, but people in other countries are actually happier. Like in the Scandinavian countries, they are leading the World Happiness Index. So that's perhaps one angle how you can start the discussion. But I agree with you.
Yeah, no, that's good.
Big elephant.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It looks like I have exhausted all your desires to ask a question and make a contribution. That would be fine by me, and I can attend to my dinner. But we can have one last question or contribution if you want.
Thomas, Steve Goldthorpe had something in chat. I don't know if he's able to post the question himself because he's got some technical issues there. But if you look in chat, he's put a question.
Yeah, good evening, Thomas. I've found an alternative power supply and I'm seem to be stable. Yeah, as you know, I'm interested in CCS. Is it my understanding that that it's largely been written off by the Climate Change Commission? Is there any point, do you think, in suggesting that some applications of CCS, particularly industrial applications rather than power, may happen when the cost per ton of CO2 emission avoided becomes less than the traded carbon price, or the other way around, the traded carbon price increases to exceed the threshold where CCS starts becoming an economic option? Do you think it's worth making a submission on that sort of basis?
I think that would make sense. I think in the past it was always so the extra cost of carbon capture made it not viable, and that's why that technology got nowhere. But if you have examples where such a calculation can be made, then from what you're saying, it looks like that's something positive.
Yeah, I mean, CCS has typically been in the order of $100 per ton of CO2 emission avoided, in round figures. And while the traded carbon price has been down in the tens, then it doesn't make sense. But as the traded carbon price is increasing, there's going to be a threshold where some applications, certainly not all, will start to simply be the most sensible thing for an industry to do. And it wants some framework that can permit that to happen, I would suggest.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we have to be careful with considering where we are at the moment. I think we have no time to waste, and the Climate Change Commission also says we should use existing technologies and get on with the job. If carbon capture becomes something that might work and might become viable in 8 years' time, then it is too late. So that's a bit the danger that the fossil fuel industry, and they are using it right now as the argument. Just let's keep us going as we do, and in 5 years' time we have carbon capture and everything will be hunky-dory.
Oh, yeah.
That's the delaying tactic, and we have to be careful that we don't get sucked in by such a delaying tactic.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Nothing more than one rather than the answer, certainly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Doug wants to say something about that.
No, it was more a follow-on question that I didn't want to hog the space before in regards to when we're talking about degrowth, that in my opinion, it's more a problem of unequal transition of wealth, unequal distribution of wealth. That's the real issue in terms that we need to deal with. So, you know, in some ways, degrowth, it comes back to consumerism, doesn't it, in terms of our society now want for more and more. And I wonder whether, in terms of a submission going back, it's you know, to deal with the New Zealanders following obviously Western other countries now, where there is fewer and fewer owning the wealth, and everything that we're doing to decarbonize is still going exactly the same track, and basically having a small few having most of that wealth and ability to make more and more from it. So I would be more comfortable having a conversation around how can we equitably, justly transition to reduce that difference between those that have and those that don't. And so I think that's an important part of it, rather than the economy, GDP needs to decrease for a country or whatever. That was the sort of thing I was meaning. I'm interested in your thought on that, whether that should be something that as ESR we should be commenting on, as the unequal distribution of wealth. And that we seem to be just accepting that it's okay for us to keep on widening the gap.
Yeah, that's certainly one aspect of it. And it always also comes up in the degrowth discussions that there are many not so developed countries that still have to grow. And that is also the uneven distribution of wealth between the north, the global north, and the global south. You can say, our wealth exists because the other half of the globe is poor. So that giving back and coming up with an equilibrium is a task ahead of us here. But when you do the numbers, it's pretty scary. If we want to bring everyone up to our standard of living. But yeah, it's an early discussion at the moment, which needs lots more thinking and talking, I admit. Brian, you have your hand up.
Thanks again, Thomas. Yeah, the question of equality and degrowth, I think, you know, you can't link them up too closely, because, you know, simple living and minimalistic living or simple living is a happy sort of way of living, you know, and all we have to do is get the level right, in a sense, you know. It's and degrowth is purely the moderation of that sort of paradigm or whatever it is, and it's not that the overshoot from the wealthy comes back to equate with the poor. It's more of an inherent living at a sustainable level, and you know, for most people, you know, we have huge entitlements that we don't realize are false, and so it's all up in the head, in a sense, you know. But yeah, I just wanted to make that point, because degrowth isn't related closely to equality.
Yeah, okay, that's another aspect. Thank you, Brian. Stuart.
Thank you, Thomas. I really enjoyed that. I thought that was very good. I don't know the numbers of this country, but I was a little surprised that offshore wind was twice the cost of onshore, because I think out in Dogger Bank, where they're doing in between where Germany, Holland, and the UK, I think, are putting quite a lot of wind turbines at the moment. They seem to be coming in with a minimum supply price of about 7 cents a kilowatt hour, I think it is. And that seemed to me fairly competitive. The second thing I was going to ask you about was the way out of this great problem of which I think it could well turn out to be, that the poor do rather badly out of this change that's going on, is that we need to change the pace of which we're introducing the technology, as you said yourself today, which is in line with my knowledge, that we have all the technology today at our hands, at our fingertips. We don't need any more developments. Wind turbines of 15 megawatts are there today and operating. So it wouldn't be difficult to speed that process up. I think my experience of working with governments is that they're quite slow at making their decisions. And I guess that's partly because they're not scientists, they're not engineers. And they don't really know whether something's around the corner that could turn everything on their head. But from our point of view, we know that the technology is there. If we could find a way to implement it more quickly, then we're going to balance the books a bit more quickly and perhaps have better distribution of wealth throughout the whole of the economy. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with you. And I have pointed that out also, introduction of new technology and better, bigger windmills. When I refer to the pricing, how the price is achieved of electricity in New Zealand and how that favors fossil fuel generation, we are not creating at the moment with our current pricing system any incentives for more renewable electricity built. There are quite a few wind farms consented, but the generators are holding back actually building them out because they can make enough money right now and sailing literally very close to the wind.
I quite agree with you. I think that's exactly the right point, that in fact it's the existing suppliers. I think the competition comes in if you can attract outside suppliers, because they have their incentivization is very different than just giving it to one of the existing suppliers, who's actually reducing the price or the likely price they're going to get for the whole of their generation capacity by installing wind or solar. Whereas a new participant would see it slightly differently and would see it as a more attractive proposition, possibly.
Mm. And with the price of offshore wind, it's just a figure I had that it's about 12 cents and compared with 6 cents, but I like to be corrected here. It's also just a thinking from first principles. There's one thing in favor of offshore wind. Out there in the sea, the wind blows more constantly than it does on land. That's why the generation is more steady, more stable. But on the other hand, you have got all these issues of the whole structures themselves are far bigger, more complicated. They are now up to 100 kilometers out in the sea. They have to be serviced. You have to go there by boat and all that, and that adds to the cost. So my understanding is the offshore wind generation is more expensive, and I had a figure quoted to me which was double the price, but that might Price is always a strange thing, as we know, that can be influenced by all sorts of.
It changes.
Yeah. But I hear what you're saying, and let's have a look. Okay, so we are going now for 1.5 hours, and I think it is time to call it. Okay, I'd like to thank you for staying with me until now, and see you at our next webinar in a month's time. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Okay, bye-bye.